Hello, fellow Grenadiers and Minutemen. This is Captain Dave reporting from the bunker on turns 7, 8, and 9 of Avalon Hill's 1974 classic wargame, 1776. The music, of course, was Britannia Rules the Waves, one of the many copyright-free Revolutionary War music selections available on YouTube. Today, we're going to see what happens in the summer of 1776. In the real war at this time, the Americans had already taken Boston without firing a shot. In this game, the British stand fast, and Washington retreats through Washington into western Connecticut in the face of oncoming massive British reinforcements. As you can see, I've started to use homemade counters for the British and the American armies, labeled General Howe and General Washington, due to the increasing size of the tower of units for both armies. The actual armies are laid out so that you can see the strength of each of the armies. These are two massive forces getting ready for a final showdown for New England and beyond. Meanwhile, in Canada, British reinforcements have arrived at Quebec and, pushing down the St. Lawrence River, now threaten Montreal and the fort at St. John's. Seeing this, the Americans decide to abandon Montreal and move all their forces into the fort, hoping to make a last stand for Canada against the British. But first we move on to the first seasonal phase. So what happens here, of course, as we've explained in previous videos, is that the American army, the regulars, get reinforcements this turn, and the militia, for both the rebel militia and the Tory militia, is adjusted. And that means that there's a certain amount they get in every region every turn, and they're not allowed to have more than that, and if they have less, they're reinforced to make up on that. And this reflects the historical reality of militia not liking to be far from home. Sure, you can raise huge militia armies and march them into some other region that they're not native to. But when you do the quarterly interphase, they're going to realize that they're far from home, they don't like it, and they're going to go home. Meanwhile, back home, they can recruit and make up those losses for the ones who are being demobilized elsewhere on the board. And that's what happens. For instance, in the British Army, they lose most of the Tory militia, which has joined Howe's army, that's chasing Washington. Because in New England, they're only allowed to have one Tory militia, so their army is reduced down to only one Tory militia. But the army that moved in from the middle states, that can be re-recruited and can actually march into New England and join Howe again on the following turn, and that's what will happen. Okay, I think next time I'm going to go into more detail on the interphase between the seasons, but right now I think what everybody wants to see is more fighting. So let's go on to our first big battle. Okay, so this is the final attack on the American fort at St. John's. You can see the fort marker. That's where the battle actually takes place. The British have 20 strength points, and they're bringing in artillery and a supply unit into the battle. Whereas the Americans only have 6 strength points with plenty of supply. But those 6 strength points are doubled to a strength of 12 because of the fort. So it breaks down to 3-2 odds, and the British have +1 on the die roll for artillery. So the first round of combat takes place. No tactical maneuver cards are used because this is attacking a fort. The British attack and they roll a 2. And that's +1 with the artillery is a 3, and what that means is both sides lose 1 strength. So the next round of combat occurs. Another 2 is rolled. Again, that equals a 3. Again, both sides lose 1 strength point. It's now down to 18 strength points for the British, whereas the Americans are down to 8. They've lost 2, but both of those points were doubled. So they're down to 4 strength points, doubled to 8. So it's 18 to 8 strength points. So that's 2-1 odds. And the British just aren't rolling well. They roll a 1, and because it's 2-1 odds, both sides lose 1. Now it's 17 to 6 strength points comparison. Again, 2-1 odds, and the British roll again a 2. Because of the greater odds, that means only the defender now loses 1 strength point. It's now 17 versus 4. It's 4-1 odds in favor of the British. The die is rolled. Now the defender loses 2. And now St. John's actually falls, because that was all they had left, was 2 strength points. The British lost 3 in this battle. They were all regulars, however. And the Americans, well, they've lost 5, so you could say the Americans have lost the battle. But really only 1 regular army has been lost. The rest has been militia, and as we continually demonstrate, the militia can spring back. So it's anybody's opinion as to who actually won the battle. On their turn, the Americans do have an artillery unit in the region, but it's all by itself without any kind of infantry escort. And because the British infantry moves faster than the American artillery, they opt to destroy that artillery unit so that the British are unable to capture it. Meanwhile, in the south, 2 American armies are making their way through Virginia to try and join the main show up in New York and New England. And they're also being shadowed by a Tory militia army of 5 strength points. They're not going to be able to do much other than possibly slow the Americans down and delay their entry into the main war. Meanwhile, Washington stays put, not too far from New York. His big move this turn is twofold. He continues to take in reinforcements, both colonial army and rebel militia. Additionally, he entrenches. He thinks he's ready to stand up to the British, at least defensively. So we'll see what happens on the next turn. So July passes, the Declaration of Independence is signed in Philadelphia, and we move on to the month of August. And one of the big things that happens in August is that the British received their last big shipment of reinforcements from England. This time it's 24 strength points, a supply, and an artillery. They're too far away from General Washington to engage him this turn, but the rest of Howe's army is looking to solve the revolution. It's now an out-and-out fight for independence, and only a big battlefield victory is going to win it for the British. So Howe marches ahead of the follow-on reinforcements coming from England, and he's going to initiate a battle. So here's what it looks like with the armies laid out. Howe is attacking Washington with 49 strength points versus 41. He's even doing this with a -1 on the attack. Both sides have artillery, so they cancel each other out, but Washington is entrenched. So Howe is taking a little bit of a gamble here, trying to bring Washington to bay. So the first round of combat happens. The British pick a frontal assault, whereas the Americans pick stand and defend, which is another -1 on the attack, so the British are now attacking with -2 on the die roll. They roll a 4, which equals a 2, and that's a lucky, in my opinion, no effect, no result from this battle, and that also ends the battle in one turn, so an indecisive clash at this point. On his turn, Washington will decide to continue his retreat and cross the Hudson, ending up just north of West Point. In the south, meanwhile, in Virginia, 2 reinforcement columns of American soldiers are moving north. Shadowing them is a British force of Tory militia of 7 strength points. And the Americans have decided they're sick of being shadowed in this manner, so they turn around a lot of their force to attack and hopefully destroy this force. The Americans have 2 colonial army and 7 militia. That's 9 strength points versus the British. But the British have no supplies, so they're halved and are now equal only to 3.5 strength points versus the American 9 strength points. That works out to 2-1 odds. So the battle begins. The Americans choose a frontal assault and the British choose a withdrawal. That gives +3 to the American attackers, so everything is coming up in favor of the Americans on the first round of combat. Additionally, the British are made up entirely of militia, and when that happens, there's another +1 added to the die roll for the attackers. So the British have +4 on their die roll. They roll a 3, that equals a 7, and that equals half of the British force being eliminated. On to the second round of combat. The Americans have a supply unit, but if they use it twice in one battle, it's expended. So they decide not to use their supply, and that means it's just even, that both sides have no supply. So it's now the Americans, they have 9 strength points. The British have been reduced to 3 strength points. That's 3-1 odds. The Americans choose an enfiladed left attack. The British choose withdraw, and that's a +0 on the attack. They still get the Americans still get the +1 because all their opponents are all militia, but they only roll a 1. That equals a 2, which is defender lose 1 step. So the British are whittled down 1 more strength point. And fortunately for the British, the combat results table indicates that that's the end of the combat. So two Tory militia points survived the battle. This feels like a great American victory. It is a great American victory. The 5 Tory militia have been eliminated at no loss to the Americans. But the thing is, you always have to remember, militia will spring back at the next quarter. So these guys are only temporarily defeated, and the Americans have been slowed down in reaching the northern battlefields. Up north, after their victory at Fort St. John's, the British force splits into 2 groups. A small contingent heads down the banks of Lake Champlain, heading for the abandoned Fort Ticonderoga. The majority of the force, however, anticipating more of a fight, heads east over the Hampshire Grant Mountains, hoping to eventually take the strategic town of Norwich. Seeing the move towards Ticonderoga, the Americans march a force of 4 freshly raised colonial army units to the fort. The British force retreats back to Fort St. John's, while the main British force continues its march on Norwich. It falls just short, unfortunately, as this is the last strategic town unoccupied by the British in New England, and its capture would have resulted in the region being conquered for King George. Elsewhere, there's a major battle of brewing as the British continue to chase General Washington, catching up with him just northwest of West Point. The armies are fairly equal in numbers. Okay, at the start of the battle, the British have 49 strength points, the Americans 41. There's no entrenchments and there's no artillery, so it's just a straight-up 1-to-1 fight. In the first round of battle, the British choose refuse the right, and the Americans choose frontal assault. That's -1 on the attacker's die roll. So a 5 is rolled, which equals a 4. Both sides lose 1 strength point, and the strength point ratio is now 48 to 40. Still 1-to-1 odds. The British choose frontal attack, and the Americans choose frontal attack. +0 on the die. A 5 is rolled, and the Americans only lose 1 strength point. It's now 48 to 39 strength points. The British choose recon in force. The Americans choose refuse the right. That's +0 on the die roll. The British roll poorly and only get a 1, and the attacker loses 2 strength points. Next round of battle, the British have 46 strength points and the Americans 39. The British again choose reduction in force, and the Americans again choose frontal assault. This is a -2 on the die for the British. A 4 is rolled, a 2 comes up, and the result is no effect, and that's the end of the battle. So battle summary for this, the Battle of West Point. The British have lost 3 strength points, the Americans have lost 2, but even worse for the British, besides losing 1 more strength point, is they've lost the last of their irreplaceable Indian allies. So this is truly, for the British, the last of their Mohicans. On their turn, the Americans will fade back from the battlefield into the Catskill Mountains, always wary of being caught by the combined British armies which are chasing them at this point. And that will end it for the summer turn of 1776. Join us next week for the fall turn of this replay of the Avalon Hill Classic. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And that's it from the bunker. We'll see you next week.